You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 2 of the Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Clive Milligan. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Franklin D. Roosevelt, who said, "When you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on." Our guest, Clive Milligan, is a law enforcement trainer with 27 years' experience in policing, advancing the reality-based training experience for police by introducing a realistic, collapsible training baton and training head. Always coming out with new, exciting products. Clive Milligan, thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me here, John.
As I mentioned, you have created several training tools. How did the idea for the Blue Baton come about?
I guess over the years, historically, we're teaching baton tactics and recertification to law enforcement. And what we had at the time was all we really had was a straight foam stick. There's a couple of really good ones out in the market, but we realized that it wasn't a actual replica of what an officer would be using if she or he had a collapsible baton with them. When I first started policing, this will date me a little bit, but we used to have the 26-inch polycarbonate baton. We had wood batons and hickory, and there were straight sticks that we had to carry around with us. When we changed over to collapsible batons, we were still using the straight foam sticks for training, and I found it wasn't that realistic. So I came up with an idea to have a baton that would be similar in working function as a street baton, but obviously with a lot less weight to it. So it was made out of a polycarbonate, spun nylon, and some other materials that made it a lot lighter. And it would collapse and open in similar fashion that an officer would have on their duty belt. So in a scenario, when the officer goes for their baton, it would be in the same place where it would be on the street, and it would act in the same function, requires some opening mechanism and a styled open, either upwards, downwards, or beside you, a little bit of centripetal force. And then you could also hit people with the baton, the training baton, if they had some proper padding on. So it made for a smoother transition from training to reality, and it built the motor programs that officers would require when they had to get to it in a real fight on the real street.
Yeah, and at first glance, it seems like a relatively basic training baton, but when you look closer, you see you used magnets to allow it to expand like a normal baton. Was this your first solution, or how many times did it take to get the formula right?
Yeah, it was a lot of trial and error and figure out how to keep it in the open position, how to keep it in the closed position so it wouldn't open by itself when it was inverted in the officer's scabbard or holster. So most of the batons out there in the street will work by a friction lock. Because it was a lighter material, there wasn't as much friction, and I worked on a couple of little retention clips, but it ended up not working as well as the magnets, and then it became a matter of trying to find the right size magnet and the right magnetic strength, and again, a lot of trial and error, as there is with everything, but in the end it worked out to be pretty realistic, and that you have to actually snap it open to get the desired extension.
Yeah. What would you say is the biggest advantage of using the Blue Baton over its predecessors, like the foam batons?
I think it's just because it does replicate exactly what an officer has to do. They have to find it in their duty belt under the stress of decision-making time to take a baton out, to use it as a tool. And therefore, it's exactly where it'll be. So their blueprint for that is exactly where it'll be on their duty belt, and it operates the same way. And then you can hit with it, obviously. The foam batons are great when we use straight stick batons, as in our riot squad, or when we used to historically carry the straight batons. But the Blue Baton is the most realistic baton out there in the market, and so far so good. People are giving me some good feedback on it.
Yeah, I could definitely see why it's it's an advantage to using it in especially reality-based training scenarios where you want everything to look or feel as real as it could. Is there any other advantage to using it like in other kinds of drills?
Yeah, you can use it striking the bag. It is almost reserved for more reality-based training. it gives the officers a chance to have an option if they have blue guns or blue spray or NLTA training converted pistols. Now they've got the full kit. They can go for whatever tool they need to use. Some of the straight batons, as I mentioned before, you'd have to stuff them in your pocket or your cargo pants pocket or the small of your back. Or an instructor would have to take a time out when you drew your collapsible baton or expandable baton. They'd have to take a time out and swap out a foamy in hand. So it kind of threw the scenario timing off, and it didn't flow naturally. So now the officer can flow, in the reality-based training. They don't have to take any breaks unless they need to. From the instructor's perspective, it'll be a more natural selection process for them. So that's one of the biggest advantages of reality-based training.
Nice. Now, going on to one of your other products, the Gouge Head is a unique training device. Now, I'm not a cop myself, but I'm sure you'd have to be in a real bad situation to be justifying using an eye gouge to defend yourself. How does that fit into police training?
Well, it's specifically reserved for the deadly force arena in the empty hand realm, or maybe a combination of both, but it certainly is a high level use of force. And it's clearly stated in the training materials when you go to the website that it's reserved for that moment when you really need to inflict a significant injury on the attacker or the subject. And it's kind of a misnomer. It's a common term, however, called eye gouging. But talking to some of the doctors as I was developing the product, it's very difficult to actually gouge an eye out. I've only had a handful of people come up to me at trade shows and exhibitions and trainers say they've actually gouged an eye or seen an eye gouged. And it requires some structural damage, usually to the occipital bone, maybe the top of the cheekbone, maxilla, and the eye's kind of sucked in with vacuum and it's tapered back into the skull. It's connected with 6 ocular muscles. There's ligaments, there's a vein, an artery, and a nerve. Lots of fatty tissue in there. So it's really hard to pull an eye out. It takes a lot of work, they said. So the name eye gouge is common, but it's really causing an injury like a corneal abrasion or a rake across the lens of the eye to create an injury that will hopefully take the attacker's mind away from what he or she is doing, i.e. assaulting or gun grabs or deadly force scenarios, and create a window of opportunity for the officer to get to his or her gun if they need to, or to continue to injure. We'll call it a spinal reflex injury. It's a term talked about in some of the higher level self-defense programs. Some of the target focused training folks will discuss this spinal reflex injury where the impact is so strong in such a delicate area of the body that the brain really has to go into a reflexive mode as opposed to sending messages for example, a gun grab. Mm-hmm. So you overwhelm the sensory input. And the eyes, of course, are extremely sensitive. There's over 1 million nerve endings, I'm told, are in around the eyes. So if you get a speck of dirt or maybe an eyelash for really low level obstruction in the eye and foreign object in the eye, it creates a reflex in human beings to close both eyes, to turn their head away from possible more dust blowing in their eyes or whatever the incident was. Now, again, at an extreme level situation, if an officer or a citizen starts to fire fingers or thumbs into the eyes, you hopefully cause that same spinal reflex overload, and it gives them a chance to escape or continue to injure if that's what's required at the time. So it's called eye gouge. It's because that's what's commonly termed.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's more to that technique, to gouging an eye than people would think, like to learn how to do it?
Oh, it's pretty simple. Historically, we used to teach, and some training still goes on today, where we'll practice eye gouge heads, and they'll have the student place his or her thumb, like a hitchhiker's thumb, the pad of the thumb, against the forehead, just above the eyebrow of the other participant in training. And the problem with that is it's the wrong tool, of the flat aspect of the thumb, the pad, into the wrong target, which is the forehead. What you really want to be doing is sharpening your tools, i.e. getting the right kind of tool, the points of the finger, the nails, into the actual eye of the human being. So under stress, we hope that the student wouldn't repeat the wrong landmarking. And now with the eye gouge head, They can actually start to put fingers in around the eyes, into the eyes. They can feel the viscosity of the training eye, and they can start to landmark. A landmarking for an eye rake or eye gouge or eye injury is going to be simple. You can find the bridge of the nose with either hand. You can find the forehead, obviously in any orientation you may be, whether you're rolling around the ground or in a car, trying to extricate yourself from a confined area. You just locate the shoulders. There goes the neck, therefore the forehead, and there's the eyes. And you start inputting energy with the tools, fingers and thumbs, and hopefully causing a corneal abrasion, which again elicits a spinal reflex injury, and it's too much for the brain to handle, and the person goes from offense to defense, and that's the chance. So you don't have to have a lot of skill, but what the eye gouge head allows you to do is get comfortable with a very uncomfortable topic, because a lot of people kind of get icked out when they think about putting fingers into people's eyes, because it's quite foreign to them. So this gives the student a chance to get comfortable with an uncomfortable subject and practice landmarking.
How real does it feel, the practice eye gouge head?
Well, it's rigid like a skull is. It doesn't have a fascia or floating skin surface to it. I didn't design the head to be a punching head. And to make it clear, it's on the website as well. It says this is not a striking head. Mm-hmm. There's many good striking targets, whether they're hand targets from sparring or MMA. There's some orb targets out there that are softer that you can strike. There's training opponent bags that you can strike that have got faces on them. But in a deadly force encounter, I wanted to ensure that the officer or the citizen, civilian who's using this, doesn't start hammering away on the human skull with an unprotected hand. And by that I mean no boxing glove, no MMA glove, no hand wraps, no wrist wraps, because when you start hammering the human skull, there's a potential that you get injured and you can't use your hand again for car keys, for cell phones to call the police, for pistols if you're fighting your way to your next best weapon system. So I wanted to keep the integrity of the hands alive and well and working. So the durometer of the head is very firm. And when you feel it, it's like, yeah, I'm going to not want to punch that, which hopefully translates to out on the road. You don't need to punch someone in the head in a deadly force encounter. You can just start landmarking the bridge, the nose, forehead, and go after the eyes. And that'll give you your chance a lot better than breaking your hand. The density and mass of the skull plates is the real tail of the tape here. The hand is a lot smaller bones, less density, less mass. And the winner of those two collisions is going to be the skull. If you can get the knockout shot with a nice left hook or an uppercut or maybe a jab perhaps into the R angle of the jaw, that's a good go-to target. But we don't want to risk missing and have a glancing blow off a skull plate, damage your own hand, and not have an effective technique or strike, causing the subject in a deadly force encounter to be injured. So we want to stay away from punching the head and go after easier targets. Everyone's eyes are the same. You go to the gym tonight or today and you'll see big, strong people, but no one's exercising their eyelids and nobody's exercising their ears, which is also a viable target on the eye gouge head.
Some trainers use fake blood behind the eye so it squirts out. What would be an advantage of doing this?
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but if some people want to go ahead and put something in there like that, it would probably give a visual, obviously maybe a kinesthetic if it's got some viscosity to it, but it'll certainly give the visual learning and it'll maybe buy into a little more of the realism of it. In an attack and you're going after the eyes, if you want to do that, then maybe the student will benefit from it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be good. I think it would make it a little more realistic too. But again, there's many blood vessels in and around the eye. There's a main artery and a vein that circulate blood into the eye that go into the foramen to meet the brain. But I've never seen a squirting eye or a traumatic eye injury. It's usually reddening and the blood's coming out from the vessels. But yeah, I mean, hey, fill your boots or fill your eye gouge head.
Right. And going on to another newer product, you have cuff training tape. That's to protect wrists during handcuff training. And this seems like, obviously a good idea. What can you tell us about it?
Over the years, handcuff training, we use either role players or actors or other officers But the problem was repeated handcuffing can get uncomfortable. And they're not designed to be comfortable, we know that. But repeated cuffing over a period of half an hour or half a day, or maybe some scenarios with some excitement and some adrenaline into it, sometimes lends itself to surface abrasions or cuts or nicks or pinches when the cuffs get bound up on someone with a bigger wrist. And it's uncomfortable. We also know that although we ask officers to clean their handcuffs prior to coming to training, maybe they haven't had time, or they forgot, or it's just too busy. So some of the surface contaminants on the metal, depending on when they last contacted someone, may be transferred in training. So we try to make it as safe as possible. So I created a flexible tape, or used a flexible tape on the market. It's like kinesthetic or K-tape, or kinesiology tape.
Right.
That when it's placed around the wrist of the officer in training, or the role player, it acts as a barrier protection. But it's also a little more advanced than just using sports tape or hockey tape. The problem with the sports and hockey tape is, one, it's uncomfortable, pulls the hair off, if that's a concern, pulls the hair off the wrist, but also doesn't have the same flexibility as this cuff training tape does. Cuff training tape is designed to flex in all different directions, so it's multi-flex tape, and it has a benefit of pulling the skin away and allowing the lymph, their circulation system, to continue. It's commonly used in sports. You notice it a lot in the Olympic athletes. Some professional sports players will use it as well for joints and circulation. So it has a feature to it that helps the body heal a little bit better as well. But the main function was that it's going to protect your role players, and they can endure the handcuffing training a little longer. It also has 6 tactical tips on there, depending on your handcuffing method. It'll apply to most common types of handcuffing. So the list of 6 tactical tips is written on the cuff tape. So as the officer approaches the SOC or the subject they're about to handcuff, they can actually read what it is they're supposed to do. It's kind of like a quarterback cheat sheet. And that, again, with the kinesthetic learning, the visual learning, they'll be able to read through this list and do the best practice. So it's just for them to refer to.
Right. And the most recent tool, I guess it's probably your latest one, is the blue training knife. How does this training tool work?
Well, blue training knife, it's brand new on the market. Just showed it at the Martial Arts Super Show in Las Vegas. Had some really good feedback on it. It's a training knife that has multi-purposes to it. And on the market, there's some excellent training knives. I mean, shock knife's a no-brainer. That's a beauty. That gets emotional buy-in immediately. Some of the training knives that are existing out there are rigid. I wanted to make a knife that was realistic looking, so it has a metallic colored blade as opposed to unicolor or black, even though there are some knives, obviously, that are black. But the majority of edged weapons or knives will be sort of silvery metallic color. So it's got the visual to it. And it also has jimping on it, like a thumb grooves. It's got a serrated base to the blade, and it's got a front guard or quillon, as it's described, and that it makes it a little more realistic. So the students using it will they'll know it's a training knife, but it certainly looks like a knife as opposed to a piece of wood or something else that doesn't have that visual buy-in to it. It only weighs 1 ounce, so it's, as far as I know, it's the lightest training knife on the market. And I wanted to make it lightweight so that if you did get hit by it, say in the torso or even on the arm somewhere, that it wouldn't have a lot of mass to it. So I was using the old formula for force, and looks something like mass times the velocity squared, and the acceleration. It's the scientific one, and obviously I'm not a scientist, but I know the lighter it is, the less potential injury it'll have when it makes contact. It also twists and flex. So when the blade twists and flex on contact, the energy is dissipated over a broader surface area as opposed to a rigid point. So it's safer if you get tagged into the floating ribs, or sometimes you get a bladder shot if the knife's come up from underneath, or into the neck. You can actually put a blue training blade into the neck without having it cause any injuries, because it's more flexible than the target is striking. You still need to wear eye pro, obviously, but I want it to be lightweight and realistic looking. And thirdly, what it does is it allows you to put a blade tape on the base of the blade, or you could if you're doing dagger training, you can put the tape around the entire circumference of the blade, apply an ink to it, and the ink is unique in that it is disappearing ink. So when you tag or when you touch your training partner with the blue blade that's had the blue training ink applied to the tape, then you'll see immediately the mark that's made. Therefore, that would be a cut or contact with the knife. The unique thing about this, and traditionally we would have to take a break and start to clean off detergent-based marking compounds. If you're using an LTA or some marking rounds, you have to take a little bit of time to brush it off or wipe it off. The unique thing about the blue training knife is the ink disappears immediately on touch. So you have less training time dedicated to cleaning time, and your iterations are a lot faster. On a white martial arts gi, for example, it'll show up as a blue streak. The hotter you get in training, usually the temperature rises with a little bit of stress and some exercise and working the system. It starts to evaporate even faster. And if you have a dark colored gi or gray tactical pants, you'll see the mark will end up as a wet streak. And that indicates you're being touched by the blade as well. And then you just wipe it clean and you're good to go. So there's very little downtime in cleaning and more time in training.
So Clive, you've been a police use of force trainer for a long time. What do you think is the number one mistake made by trainers?
Well, I've made the mistake myself, and it's probably one of the best ways to learn. And that is I'll observe police officers or recruits learning a new skill, and my previous training experience would be I would step in and try and correct them right away, because I could see whether it was say a takedown or some handcuffing, and I wanted to be there to almost like a helicopter dad and go, oh, no, use your left hand. Okay, if you hold the right hand here, and they would get the procedure, they would complete the task, but it's only because I was standing over them telling them which step to go to next, because I wanted them to succeed. After learning about learning, I would hold back and let them make mistakes in a training environment, say on the first iteration, if they're coming back to revisit handcuffing. Typically, I'd say, okay, let's do a prone subject is prone, handcuff them now, go ahead. And I would then observe them working their way through the process, whether it be the top knee down or a sprinter's toe, or all these little teaching tools used along the way, and remind ourselves these teaching analogies. And okay, now it's a good body position, hand close to the head takes the cuffs out, and it can be for any task, but say using handcuff for example. And now they'll stall for a minute, and they're starting to figure out how to best solve this, as opposed to having helicopter cop dad in there saying, okay, do this, do that, the other thing. So once they get to a point where they don't know the answer and they've trial and errored it, they'll really look up for some help. And that's when now I and the other instructors, we move in and go, okay, what you got going on here? Let them explain what they've done so far, and let them be the fixers of the problem. And then we can ask simple questions like, well, what are you going to do next? What's next? And then they'll think about it, and their brains will start to tie together all the schemas or the bundles of knowledge they've learned the last week, or maybe even last year, or it could be an hour ago, and they'll start to tie it all together. And then when we ask for the next iteration, they've already done their correction themselves. So they've felt it, they've experienced it, and they've made a mistake. They know how to fix that mistake, as opposed to us not even seeing it or asking them about it, and they leave the training venue with their best effort of the day. And they can still also learn if the scenarios are pretty intense. We understand now people will be learning when they're driving home. Hopefully they're not too distracted. They'll also be learning when they're at rest, and they'll be learning when they're fast asleep, when their brain's processing the events that took place that day. So we know that there's a lot more to learning than just show and tell. People have to get into it, the olfactory, the smells, the sights, the sounds, the touch. Their whole emotional buy-in, particularly in reality-based training, is all about creating a blueprint for success under reality-based situations of stress. So the more sound you can get in there, the more realistic screams, the more emotional sort of the psychological aspect of it all, the jitters, the increased heart rate, combat breathing, and there's so much to learn as an instructor, that we want them to be the best they can be. And when they leave the training venue, we hope they've had an emotional attachment to the training. And then, our job is done for the day, and then we figure out how we can do it a little bit better as well. So that's, one thing I had learned was I was making the mistake of trying to show them the right way right off the bat, as opposed to letting them fluster around for a little bit and come up with their own solutions.
Right. Yeah. Everyone has a different way of figuring things out, and it makes sense that sometimes you just have to let people try to figure it out before giving them an answer, right?
Absolutely.
And what do you think? I know there's so many different things, but a broad question: what do you think would be the most important component of officer safety training?
Yeah, great question. It's like a couple of hours long and some more research, but let's say it starts at the top. And if you got a chief or someone in charge of your organization who understands the value of training their officers and participates in training with the officers and certifies with the line staff, then the morale and the understanding, the importance of training will be increased for everybody. And then it reflects in the general public when the public sees the chief is well turned out, and she or he has an ability to carry themselves with confidence and competence, and that they'll, if need be, they can wrestle someone on the ground if that's what's required. And so there's a big focus on officer safety training, but the executive training is really, really important. They'll also then come to understand that it's not as easy as it may sound in a classroom when you actually get involved in trying to control the human body or the human being that may not want to be controlled. We look at a whole host of other issues there. And so officer fitness is important, but also training is extremely important. And you look to other professions out there, and we know law enforcement most of the time is talking to people, which is great. De-escalation is fantastic. Very rarely does an officer have to get into a high-level use of force incident. But when he or she does, we want them to be able to protect themselves and the public and also the subject they're dealing with. So it requires some repetition and training, some reasonable training, something that would be recognized as to be reasonable by a court or the court of the land or a jury, to show that it's not officers just to go there and hammer someone. They're going to have to go and try lower levels of force if possible, and then understand how the body works. And it's all about balance. It's all about intentionally causing people to fall down and lose their balance, and then keeping close, keeping control, getting the handcuffs on quickly, de-escalation. So what quite often happens is in a lot of organizations, training may be the hatchet target on some budgets, but it has changed. The perception of training is no longer a bunch of knuckle draggers and kung fu fighting. It's more it's a lot more professional, a lot more focused on how to use force most effectively, that'll be safer for the subject who's having force used against him or her, the officer, and also the organization, and that's acceptable by the public. So the public expects police officers to be able to handle the situations that they weren't able to at the time, and now as long as training's supported, and that is organizationally supported or provincially supported or state supported or municipally supported, then it does cost a little more money, but you can pay now or pay later. And we now know that the focus on police use of force is pretty intense, and therefore you would think it'd be a natural for the executives of the organization to want to put the officer's best foot forward to provide her or him the best training. So it has changed over the years, which is great. So that's a super important component of officer safety training. And that's, I think it starts at the top.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about all the different things you've been working on and just about training in general. So I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, Clive Milligan, for coming on.
My pleasure, John. Thanks to you.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.